And hello and welcome to the cinema of the DFF. I have to make the sad announcement that we won't be able to show the short film Olingo by Emili Tolo. It was proposed by Karina to screen it before They Call It Love. And unfortunately, it's a good thing that it's being restored right now, but the bad thing about it for us is that it's not possible to screen it until it's finished. I think it's one of the absurd and maybe stupid also aspects of the rediscovery of forgotten films, that for a while nobody cares about them. When people do care, suddenly it gets important to restrict access again. But maybe it's also something we could talk about later, like this aspect of media economy and when films are important and when not. So yeah, this only as a short announcement before, and now I'll hand over to Vincent Sediger, I think, to introduce tonight's guests. Thank you.
Yes, good evening from my side too. My name is Vincent Sediger. I'm a professor of cinema studies at Goethe University here in Frankfurt, and one of the curators of the series, together with Didi Chico here in the front row, who recently rejoined us from Lagos for the summer part of the series. So he's going to be here for the whole thing until the end of July, which is great. Danny Fairfax is also a co-curator, and we did this and couldn't have done it without the input that Feven Heile also gave us in the conception and planning of the series, for which we're extremely grateful. I would also like to thank our funders and sponsors. This series is made possible through the Oedicus Fund of the Goethe University, which is a special fund for outreach and university city cooperations, and the Hessen Film- und Medienakademie, and also the Research Center Normative Orders at Goethe University, which hosted until March 31st the Contrast Research Initiative, which provided the funds for the first half of this series. Our guest tonight is Dr. Karina Griffith, Professor Dr. Karina Griffith from the Universität der Künste in Berlin. Karina Griffith earned her first degree in cinema studies from the University of Toronto, which is also her hometown. Then she moved to Goldsmith College and then made for a master's, and then made another eastward move to Berlin, where she completed her dissertation on Black German cinema fairly recently, and we're all looking forward to reading the book that comes out of it very, very soon. Karina Griffith, apart from her work as a scholar, is an important educator. As you can see, she's currently a guest professor aus Mitteln des Berliner Programms zur Förderung der Chancengleichheit für Frauen in Forschung und Lehre. I used to have a Krupp Foundation professorship, which also had one of these very long titles, and I love to use it, like Alfred Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach Stiftungsprofessur für blah blah blah. So I think if you have one of those, you should flash it. It's the way to go. But also, very importantly, for German film culture, international film culture, of which this is also an important site. Karina Griffith has worked as one of the curators of the Forum Expanded section of the Berlinale for some time now. And if you're familiar with that particular format, you know that it bridges the space between the classical film festival work and the art world in a very unique and innovative way. And Karina has been part of the new curatorial team since the transition to that curatorial team, which I think was 3 years ago. 3 years ago, more or less, yes. And it's this absolutely unique and incredible platform which Karina has been shaping with her vision in extremely important ways. Looking forward to what's happening later this year. She's going to be a curatorial fellow in Salvador de Bahia in Brazil, which brings her closer to the home of her family, which is Guyana, and which I'm mentioning here because it creates a connection to one of our previous speakers in the series, Iabo Guyana, who teaches at Dartmouth, a filmmaker, and who introduced the terror and the time, if you remember, back in the winter term. So there is also this Caribbean connection to Karina's biography. We're very glad that you accepted our invitation, and we're very much looking forward to what you have to tell us about Flânoirie, which is a neologism that I absolutely love. Please, come on. Hands are too long.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you all for coming today. This is really nice turnout. I have more people to thank. Vincenz, again, great. Thank you for the introduction, for the invitation. Didi as well. Thank you so much for inviting me. And for Björn, thank you as well for all of your support. I also want to thank as well Fiven Hyla for support, and also my colleagues at the Institute sorry. I think my glasses threw me off. I really want to thank my colleagues at the Institute for the Fakultät Gestaltung for also workshopping this with me. So this lecture sets out to explore walking and wandering Black subjects in German cinema. And here the focus is on strategies within the mise-en-scène and a fresh understanding of studio as a place where the impossible can be made possible in practice. And I also will be introducing the term Flânoirie, which encompasses my ideas around walking while Black and the Black flaneur. It is often out of my artistic practice that larger theoretical questions emerge, and I will be returning to that at the end of the lecture, and also talking again about this aspect of access to the archive and what Björn so rightly called a media economy. I want to introduce a method of projection studies, broadly an approach that takes into consideration the circuits, archives, and apparatus of a film in its textual analysis. And I will also talk about vibes, which is kind of my workaround in and through affect theory. So these ideas and methods form my readings of two films, King Ampaw's They Call It Love and Olingo, which is a short film directed by Emile Itolo, a student at Babelsberg in Potsdam. And that's the film that unfortunately we will not be able to see today, but I'm still going to speak about it. Both Black and these are both student films that were made in black and white, and they both feature wandering male Black protagonists in Germany. And what I find quite striking is both of these films start and end with a long single take of a Black man walking. And this scene for me is something that feels like an inhale. So within each of these films, I see in the mise-en-scène a place of possibility that is a speculative space, and I identify this space as the studio. And it's literally a studio, and They Call It Love, but more figuratively in Olingo, a place of possibility where possibility is an affect with a bodily response of breath. So the studio for me is literally a breathing room, a place of exhale. So after graduating from Accra Technical Institute in 1960, King Ampaw came to former East Germany and worked in a photo camera factory in Dresden. And he soon became fascinated with the idea of not only making cameras, but using them. Ampaw started studying at the Academy of Film in Potsdam, Germany, until the National Liberation Council overthrew the Ghanaian Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah's government. He was advised by those who ousted Nkrumah to go to the West, and he relocated and started studying in the Academy of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna, Austria, until the University of Munich opened its Academy of Television and Film in 1967. Ampaw's presence in both the Potsdam University and the Munich Film School must have been significant. He jokes about studying with Werner Herzog and Wim Wenders, with whom he still shares significant rapport. Last I spoke with him. They Call It Love is the thesis film of King Ampaw. It was produced at the Munich Film Academy in '72 to complete his film studies. It screened at the Carthage Film Festival in Tunis in 1974, and it has remained since then property of the Munich Film School. And until recently, King Ampaw himself never owned a copy of his own film. That changed with the work of Tobias Hering a few years ago. What is at stake when new German cinema includes a Black director in its canon? How does Blackness interact with our notions of national genres and movements? What does Black mobility on film do to conceptions of Europe and cinema? Feeling through films brings conversations about national cinema to another level, and the concept of German cinema creates borders and constraints that a possible understanding of what's going on in the moment. The Reconstruction revolution that was happening in the 60s. And when we look back intersectionally, the moments when class struggle cross race, gender, and sexuality, they force changes that are significant but are later often erased. So this lecture is going to discuss the intersectional methods of subversion in my ongoing artistic research into the genealogies of Black German cinema, and thinking about what practices of repair are possible through artistic research and curatorial practice. So, to be a projectionist is to engage not in interpretations that will resolve the cinematographic work, but rather in interactions that might disclose its complexity. This is a quote from Gabriel Minnati's projection studies, and something that's been really helpful for me in terms of making sense of my own practice as a visual artist and a film scholar and curator and, archivist as well. And what it is, it's about thinking about not just the text of the film, but also the circuits, the archives, and the apparatus around the film as well. So how does a film move? How is it stored? And what does it need in order to be seen? Black German cinemas are often characterized by their alternative production institutional structure. However, unlike avant-garde films, Black-authored cinemas in Germany have not historically received support for distribution. Many of these films have not been seen for decades when they were in the German Film Academy archives, and most importantly, some directors, as I just mentioned, were not in possession of copies and are not able to know exactly what's happening with their films. So I say that these films are not avant-garde, but avant de regarder, because we have not even seen them. So let's talk about They Call It Love. The opening shot of They Call It Love features a steady shot, perfect, a German side street. A Black man saunters towards the camera. He owns the frame before we even see him, since the camera is placed for his trajectory. The deep focus wide shot is held until he's centered in full view and walks out of the frame. This visual treatment of a Black man walking in Germany represents belonging to the frame, to the culture, to the cinema. They Call It Love is a cinema verite musical depicting a love story in Bavaria. The main protagonist, Paul, is a former US soldier, now playing and singing in a blues band. He struggles to find lasting relationship with the white German women he encounters between the record store, the studio, and the club. Director King Ampaw's portrayal of the Black male GI in this romantic drama is measured and sensitive. And these feelings come through for me in these long single-take moments, also around the musical performances and the walking scenes where this protagonist masters his city. What I want to identify in this section is the idea of the studio as a place where complex Black masculinities are possible. For me, these walking scenes foreshadow this place of possibility. And I will start by introducing this concept of the Flânoirie and what this figure makes possible in Black German cinemas. So the masculine term Flânoirie was likely coined by French columnist Xavier Aubray in the Revue du Jour section of the pamphlet Le Gallois. He used the term to express the changing nature of Parisian promenades in 1877 due to immigration. And this was his quote. In the past, the boulevard was only the promenoir of the Parisian city. Today it has become the Flânoirie of the suburbs. Montmartre, La Vallée, and Bellevue really send it to many delegates. And the equality between the blouse and the jacket is yet to complete, for there is not even a frock coat anymore. So this gossip columnist is talking about a place which he names the Flânoirie. And in this above passage, the Flânoirie can be used to understand a place in opposition to this promenoir, which is a kind of sometimes covered passageway for walking. He's expressing his disdain for the change in the populace strolling the boulevards of Paris. And to understand, like, this Bellevue district of Paris is a working class neighborhood. This is the site of the Paris Commune uprising in 1871. So for Aubray, this Flânoirie is a place for a lower class population, delegates, as he so elegantly calls them, people from the outside. And so I'll continue with the etymology because I really like to geek out on words. This term caught on, and it was quoted in Parisian Sketch and Designs, a chronicle of the present. And then it was also cited in Le Petit Journal in 1929. And there they were citing again Auber's use of the word, the Flânoirie of Paris, becoming a cosmopolitan crowd. So here the pedestrians are the Flânoirie. The pedestrians of the Flânoirie are not considered Parisian, but rather immigrants to Paris. So what I'm saying here is, in my own studio of my mind, I think of this idea of the black flaneur, the Flânoirie. But what I've done is gone back and seen that this word actually exists. And but I find the original use of the word is quite well connected to this idea of a black flaneur. So in the late 1920s, society papers are making mention of Flânoirie, which is this elegant villa in the south of France. So again, it's this like exotic place somewhere, somehow outside. And then in 1952, a jury chaired by the general director of Air France voted on official French translations for English words that had infiltrated the international travel industry. So English words were now becoming integrated into France, and this was a no-go. And so there were words like no-show, rack, and then also the English word lounge. And they were looking for French words to replace these English words that were infiltrating Air France's language. And so these were the words that were up for scrutiny in need of proper French translations to keep this Anglophone words at bay. And here, Flânoirie was nominated to replace lounge. And so it almost came close to being the official French translation for the lounge. And this is what they had to say: lounge, male noun, or sky lounge in an aircraft, a place with tables and seats for groups of passengers to leave their seats and meet there. They adopted instead the word salon, but in preference to the term Flânoirie, which received several votes. So this word Flânoirie almost became legitimate as the official French translation for the word for lounge. And in this context, it connects the immigrant connotation with temporary, halted mobility, albeit the luxurious version in the airport lounge. So how can we understand the contemporary Flânoirie? I'm offering the word as a noun to describe not a place, but a person, a wandering figure, and a specific Black position and the feelings related to the different ways people experience walking in the city. And I use this French word not just to emphasize noir, the French word for Black, but also to connect this type of Black speculative movement to the tradition of the flaneur and la flâneuse, a European figure whose practices of walking, strolling, ambling, and wandering in leisurely manner are as meaningful, if not more, than their destination. In order to think and feel through what Flânoirie could be, I employ what Ronaldo Walcott calls nomadology, which is a practice of thinking about, quote, movement and exile in a fashion which makes those conditions a part of the way in which cultural work is understood and valued. So the nomadology of the Flânoir on film explores the gestures of Black pedestrians considered by their appearance to be visitors en route to somewhere else. Oops. It is used in this research to describe the Black wandering figure of Europe. I just tease where we're going. The Flânoir shares some of the characteristics of Walter Benjamin and Charles Baudelaires' Flâneur. Both the Flâneur and the Flânoir encounter the city through walking. In common, each figure reads the face of the metropolis. They inscribe their relationship to space on the sidewalk with the paths they cut through the streets and alleyways. However, the Flânoir's experience of the metropolis is different than that of the Flâneur. And we see and feel this very clearly in Olingo and They Call It Love. The intersectional significance of their skin and gender makes their movements and claim to space unique. While Benjamin's Flâneur can be invisible in a crowd, the Flânoir is never invisible. Their hypervisibility or hyperinvisibility necessitates new words. And Friedberg's introduction of the flâneuse was an intervention that opened up conversations about how women move in public spaces and on screen. Lauren Elkin introduced the term flâneuserie to reconsider the concept. And so flânoir is a tool with which to discuss bodies in motion. Context becomes important in understanding the intersectional nuances of the word. And similar to flânerie and flâneuserie, flânoirie is not just a way of walking or wandering, but a way of seeing and being seen. The flânoir rejects consternation. They're kinetic and do not allow despair to stultify them. Our flânoir is both guest and host to themselves in their enunciation of place through mobility. And in film, the flânoir wanders both on imaginary and concrete planes. We have to go there. So I might be preaching to the choir, but I'm going to go ahead and do the due diligence. Betroffenheit's Kino is known colloquially as guilt-fueled cinema. It is a German word that has historically been used to describe cinema made by or about migrant workers, refugees, and minority populations and their struggles. Betroffenheit's Kino films were often made from the dominant German perspective, resulting in, and this is a quote from Omar Alkin, patriarchal and appropriating representations on migrant cinema. So Omar Alkin, among others, generates more discourse on these films and demands differentiation. Through film archival work, it is shown that the 70s did not only produce Betroffenheit's Kino in terms of Turkish film production, and this is Alkin who's arguing that the scholarly discussion in North America wrongly asserts that Turkish-German cinema, started in Germany. This is falsely understanding Betroffenheit's Kino as synonymous with Turkish-German cinema, and I guess I'm saying I don't want that to happen with Black German cinemas. Alkin identifies different contributions, so de-integrations films, which are named so to indicate their counterproductive natures of these films, and guest worker films made in Turkey about protagonists with a connection to continental Europe, in addition to Betroffenheit's Kino with its Eurocentric gaze. So I kind of also take issue with what is lost in translation with Betroffenheit's Kino, and this kind of unidirectionality implied in the affective relationships to these films. Again, we're going back to vibes. The scholarly literature has translated Betroffenheits Kino as cinema of duty and also cinema of the affected. And the latter comes from a translation of the adjective betroffen, so which can be, affected or concerned. But this translation defines the films by their authors and protagonists who were traditionally of migrant class. And it's, for me, insufficient or ironic when the word is used to describe, German films made about first world problems. So the term cinema of duty, which was coined by Canadian film critic and who's now creative director of the Toronto International Film Festival, Cameron Bailey, to describe the films of Black Canadian filmmaker Jennifer Hodge de Silva. So claim of duty indexes the duty of the protagonist and not necessarily of the spectator. And this condition is not necessarily present in the German film counterpart. So my research kind of starts with this claim that neither term is sufficient. And so I'm calling it kind of like the translation for Betroffenheits Kino is more like a cinema of consternation, thinking instead of a cinema of the affected, but of a specific group of affects. So we can be specific about what kind of vibes are in these films. So I want to feel through how we can read Black visuality in films that deal with Betroffenheit, but are not Betroffenheits Kino. And so, what are the vibes of Flânoirie films? So in his book, Film Blackness, Michael Gillespie asserts that, quote, film blackness denotes a reading practice devoted to the cinematic, the visual production of blackness, Black visuality, and the critical ways that art disputes, distends, and aspires. So part of this reading practice is feeling through affect in a similarly critical way. So this research approaches the distinctions between emotion, feeling, and affect with political fluidity. These vibes, to borrow from Black slang, they resonate between the spectator, the moving image, the paratext, and the screening situation of these cinemas. Vibes or vibrations are embodied emotions and feelings connected to rhythm. They index a type of wisdom exchanged through resonance. To be vibing means to be on the same frequency that brings a sonic element to affect that is listening in the body. Luis Manuel Garcia uses the term vibrational affect to work around this pre-personal approach to affect theory that lacks space for thinking about representation. And in Julian Henrique's research on the vibrations of affect in dancehall music, he describes affective response as building the vibes, where each iteration of the beat of a continuous rhythm has the effect of both reinforcing the effective impact of the last one, as well as building on an effective expectation for the next, end quote. When Garcia and Hernandez's research, it's focusing primarily on sonic experiences. The impulse to think about affect as culturally specific is useful here. Its use in this research helps to subvert the subject question, which is more complex in terms of Black experiences in affect studies. And for those who've dabbled in affect studies, you know what I mean. I don't want to get stuck up here with affect studies. However, we can talk about Brian Masumi. Brian Masumi also evokes vibration to describe what he calls intensities, which are both affects and a measurement for affects. So, quote, it is filled with motion, vibratory motion, and resonance, end quote. However, Masumi's autonomy of affect poses challenges when discussing cultural specificities of affective relationships. So instead, Sayanai's approach to expanding how we understand feelings unique to our encounters with artworks through identifying unpopular aesthetic emotions feeds my approach and use of affect here. And so maybe I'll just start in the middle here. Rather than also trying to dissolve this subjective-objective problematic by creating two distinct categories of feelings, her study aims to preserve it for the aesthetic productivity we see not just in the meaningful ironies or specific feelings generated by film noir's oscillations between first-person and third-person point of view, but also in the concept of cinematic or literary tone. So this idea of being able to be fluid politically with using affect. So the focus on aesthetic productivity, similar to Gillespie's insistence on reading Black film through form, is the lens through which this research understands affect in these cinemas. So for the purpose of this study, affect is defined as a feeling or vibration that begins as a precognitive bodily response. Concept of movement and as language have a particular grammar. So what is the grammar of Flânoirie? The Flânoir, when walking the streets and natural landscape of Europe, is privy to many feelings connected to an acute awareness of the history of Black people in these spaces. Christina Sharp calls this consciousness being in the wake. Her project is not about how Black people resolve this persistent anti-Blackness, but rather how Black culture bears witness to and negotiates these experiences. Put another way, living in the wake means living in and with the terror, in that much of what passes for public discourse about terror, we, Black people, become the carriers of terror, terror's embodiment, and not the primary object of terror's multiple enactments, the ground of terror's possibility globally. This is everywhere clear as we think about those Black people in the United States who can weaponize sidewalks, Trayvon Martin, and shoot themselves while handcuffed, Victor White III, Chavez Carter, Jesus Huerta, and more. Those Black people transmigrating the African continent towards the Mediterranean and then to Europe, who are imagined as insects, swarms, vectors of disease, familiar narratives of danger and disaster that attach to our always weaponized Black bodies. The weapon is Blackness, end quote. And let me take a moment to extend Christina Sharp's list with some names that hit closer to home. Ndiaye Marie-Messar, 26, fatally shot by German police in 2001. Laye Almana Condé, 35, dead in police custody in Bremen, 2004. Olujaro, 36, burned to death in police custody in Dessau in 2005. Dominic Kumar Dio, 23, fatally shot by police in Dortmund, 2006. Christy Schwudeneck, 39, fatally shot by German police at the Job Center in Frankfurt, 19th of May, 2011. And Lorenzo A., 21-year-old, fatally shot by German police 6 times in the back, April 20th, 2025, in Oldenburg. Sharp goes further and delineates the impossible possibilities of Black people in the wake. The weather, for Sharp, is the inescapable climate of anti-Blackness that is all-encompassing as the atmosphere and the air in which we breathe. She simultaneously asks, what is possible when we accept that anti-Blackness is the atmosphere where we live? Moreover, what levels of terror are impossible in this accepted anti-Black climate? In waking life, it is impossible to interrupt precognitive feelings and the bodily response, or to abdicate from atmosphere, but in film, the impossible is possible. So, this idea of an effective, safer space. Places of possibility are a physical enclave where neocolonialist affects open up to repertory imaginings about Black freedom. And in this way, Flânoirie and Flânoir films are part of what Christina Sharp calls wake work, specifically in its use of Black redaction and Black annotation that she outlines in her final chapter. Formal choices about setting and performance transpose these novel methodologies of living in the wake. So Flânoirie is a type of confident fugitivity. What is possible when we think of the studio as a place to recreate or develop a second nature? The studio as an environment that allows one to be outside of oneself and the biases and constraints of society. places of possibility are always outside in a sense that they are external to these various constrictive insides. In this way, we can think of en plein air to be a type of atmosphere that Black people accept into the body as opposed to the stifling air inside of the hostile spaces. So, breath. The place of possibility is a breathing room. And again, here I'm referring to Sharp and what she calls aspiration, quote, keeping breath in the Black body. A place of possibility is breathing room. It's sufficient space to recover from the pervasiveness of anti-Blackness. And in the case of, they call it love and Olingo, for me, these places of possibilities are the studio and the guest room, respectively. One of the most unique scenes in They Call It Love comes later in the narrative when Paul goes to the recording studio. Here, cinema verite is augmented by the fluid jav talk of the musicians as they unload their instruments from the truck. Ampaw films this scene in a distant wide shot consisting of one single take, which mirrors the opening scene. Next shot, we're inside the studio, and similar patience is applied with a steady wide shot, continuing banter in the US-American slang, which punctures the German dialect of the rest of the film. So already in the parking lot of the studio, the weather of They Call It Love changes. The studio scene looks and feels like another film within a film. And just like in the record shop at the beginning of the film, Paul and his colleagues enter the studio and the doors close behind him and the camera waits outside for a few moments. So this treatment is mirrored in the opening scene, as I said, and we are left to observe as spectators outside of the glass. After a long anticipated cut, we're in the room with the musicians, but we still see them from a distance. And Ampaw does not translate their thick American slang into German, so no subtitles, no overdub. And the performance in this space comes across as improvised. They're loose and with much different rhythm in the dialogue interaction, less pause time, more speaking over and under. The bodies of the men are more close to each other, and the interaction in the other scenes where Black people are in the minority, so they're actually like physically more in proximity. Save for the sex scenes, there is very little touch between people in They Call It Love, or I could say I feel a different intimacy in these scenes. And so in the parking lot, they're greeting each other warmly, and it's just, as I said, a different vibe. So returning to this idea of the studio, borrowed from the Italian word for study, studium, a studio is a place for practice. In the studio, the artist and the musician exercise their skills. A studio, as in a study album, is a recording of practice. The expectation is that the format is loose, more improvised, and smaller scale than a professional record. So a studio film has a similar connotation. The studio is a place for study through practice, repetition, and drafting. And in this place of possibility, the Black artists sketch out new ways of seeing and being seen and having been seen. And these confines of this exclusive realm kind of are productive. I want to move ahead because I think we're running out of time. Let's see. I'll go straight to Olingo. Olingo is a short black and white film directed by Emile Itoli during his studies in Deutsche Hochschule für Filmkunst, which later became the Universität Babelsberg Konrad Wolf in Potsdam. Again, a cinema verite style, and it has aesthetic similarities to King Ampaw. And while both the male protagonists have to contend with prejudice, discrimination present in Olingo is more overt. The film depicts this young man, played by Kwama Luke, in search of accommodation in the city. He researches, he's going door to door to different apartments to try and get a place, only to be rejected at the door of the apartment owners. So his blackness is not allowed to cross the threshold. Thematically, Olingo treads in the affective realm of Betroffenheitskino. the narrative does not indicate that the protagonist develops or implements strategies to change a situation. However, I'm beginning to see active affects in the mise-en-scène, in particularly the way in which the stairwell scene is shot and the setting and the props in the guest room, this place of possibility or studio for German hospitality. The protagonist makes a connection with a young white German boy who invites him in to wait for his father to ask about the room. And after questioning, Olingo patiently explains his skin color to the boy and discusses the continent from which he comes. He reveals his name when asked, but the boy does not respond in kind, just continues his round of questioning. So this remedial level of discourse and relenting to this request to explain one ontology mimics the perpetual immaturity of Germans' relationship with difference. And Fatima El-Tayyib calls this the kindergarten birthday party, a performance of German culture where the genuine engagement with structural inequalities is distracted by the interminable justification by way of description. So the conversation, the boy seems naive, but this pattern of justifying oneself and one's presence and difference speaks to a more, extensive process of othering. And this kind of what I call like a perpetual border control. So at first it seems that this protagonist, Olingo, is frozen in this dilemma, but while he has the capacity to walk through the city, this consternation of his situation finds him locked in this dismal position. It's really kind of like Groundhog Day in a way, like it's 11 minutes of him doing, going around. And this distinction between mobility, a capacity for movement, and motility, the ability to move, is kind of important here. But my new reading of this film is that this guest room is also a kind of place of possibility. This is like a place, the exhale to the inhale of the walking scene. It is here that Olingo exhales. So he's unpacking his suitcase with the help of this boy, and they change the space. I mean, Olingo puts on an African print shirt, and the boy's like unpacks this photo of Lumumba and even gets like a short history lesson. When the boy's father comes home, he remarks on the change room, he says, na, Sie haben ja schon häuslich eingerichtet. So you made yourself quite comfortable. Yeah. And Olingo is forced to leave, but not before leaving something behind. He leaves the boy a small stone carving of an elephant that the boy had admired earlier. So this guest room is forever changed. And I'm thinking now about this guest room as a studio where it's possible to practice respectful interaction. I think I'm going to skip ahead. I was going to go into Saidiya Hartman and walking and wandering, and Michel de Soto, but we could talk about that later, because I want to get to this question of the archive. Because it's not the first time that in my research where I've had difficulty accessing a film. And in a way, speaking again about projection studies in my practice, so I have a visual arts practice, I have a curatorial practice, and a scholarly practice. And I like to think of my research as kind of, it's like a zucchini plant, and the research is the stem, and maybe, these talks and publications and curatorial work maybe are the zucchinis, but the visual work is the zucchini blossoms. So I'm going to show you some zucchini blossoms. And perhaps it's to make a kind of transition, maybe this is, for me, my kind of fugitive space of Black study. So in 2018, I received a studio residency as part of a project by District Berlin in the framework of Decolonizing 68, an intersectional alliance of the project Art of Revolt and Spaces Gallery Osnan and Poznan, Alpha Nova, Gallery Futura and District, and also the Gunnar Werner Institute. And this was a project kind of aimed at questions of decolonizing 68 and the production of history, and how to retell the movements of the 1960s from the perspectives of its anti-colonial, diasporic, feminist, and Black organizations. And so for me, I was asking this question, how can you decolonize 68 if you hadn't decolonized 2018? But I was interested in looking at films that weren't being seen. So that's how I found They Call It Love. So my plan for the residency where I developed this work was to interact with the content of the film on an intersectional level. However, things didn't go as planned because I didn't get a copy of the film. It was the archive in Munich, as well as the Bundesarchiv, and the film was not in good enough condition, and also the soundtrack, apparently the rights weren't clear. This is what I was told, why I couldn't get a copy of the film. And so I had to pivot. The lack of entry into the archive became the main topic of my installation. So without permission from the film archives to screen They Call It Love, I should have given maybe a warning. This is how I was introduced to the film, and this is why I really wanted to interact with it on an intersectional level. So let me move forward. Without permission from the film archive to screen They Call It Love, my installation shows the film in other resistant ways, through paper flipbooks made with a bootleg copy of the film, and in conversation with the Human Archive filmmaker King Ampaw, with a speculative alternative soundtrack, and through watching the archive. So this is the speculative alternative soundtrack of records, which I always sort of find in the spaces where I show the exhibition. And it's my dream crate of like all Black women musicians. This is the interview with King Ampaw, the living archive. And on the other side, you see my 70-minute shot of the Bundesarchiv, because if I can't watch the film, then I'll stand and watch the archive for 70 minutes. So, without permission from the film archive to screen They Call It Love, my installation shows it again in different resistant ways. And the flipbook version of the film includes 2 new scenes where I insert myself into the film. So I introduce a Black protagonist and create a speculative alternative plot. So when you see the film, you'll see where I inserted myself. So this is like foreshadowing a bit the film. So what I'm doing here is kind of returning the gaze of both the filmmaker and the archive that was refused to release the film for decades. So in this imaginatory repertory form, the copy is in the hands of the spectators, and similarly, the soundtrack of the film is under construction. And I titled this installation, We Call It Love, an oppositional screening, to think about how the oppositional gaze can affect an entirely new sort of viewing experience. And this new viewing experience is necessary in terms of spectatorship and access to these difficult to access films. When Black Germans are not considered part of German cinemas, they're systematically made rare. And we could talk more about that connection to the archive and the care of care work in our chat. Oppositional gaze is coming from bell hooks, and it's an intersectional practice of watching without submitting to that which is being watched. An oppositional screening, then, is a way of showing something without submitting to that which is being shown. It is a choice to exhibit a cinematic text in a critical way, to draw attention to the challenges of access, not just to the film itself, but also to the narrative. So They Call It Love, which we're about to see now, is a film that shows the path of a Black GI in Munich, from the club to the track to the bed. And I look forward to talking to you, I guess, about this final question, which I continue to explore in my practice and research, which is how do form and distribution relate to Flânoirie films. We're talking about the idea of mobility and movement, and then these films all have a difficulty of moving. And is this a characteristic of this category? So this work is a series, and you guys can guess what the next flipbooks will be. Thank you for listening to my interactions. not interpretations of Olingo, and They Call It Love. And I really look forward to the conversation after the film. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for the introduction and the presentation of the film. And I already told you right after the talk that there's one concept or idea that I want to immediately pick up on. The idea of the studio space, which you used for both films, here for the rehearsal scene, but it has broader applications as well, and then for Olingo for the apartment and the transformation of the apartment through the gift of the sculpture.
The guest room.
Yeah. Can you say more about what kind of a space the studio is, or how the studio space functions in the whole, let's say, ecology of spaces, also in relation to race, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being such an attentive audience. This is great. Yeah, the studio, I mean, you see it here, especially in They Call It Love. The scene seems like another film. There's a whole other type of interaction that takes place, type of the improvisation, but more broadly, the studio as a space for productive error or for error at all. And thinking about like this question, which I also kind of continue to ask in my work, like how to make mistakes while Black, like a space where Black people can actually make error without this kind of like hefty penalty that is in this in the wake. So the studio literally as a studium, a place to study, a place to make error, but for also I guess for everybody to make error. In the studio here, it is all Black people in this space, but in Olingo, it's also this like very naive child who's asking these questions, and it's really awkward. I mean, it's really awkward, but somehow it gets to this place of understanding. And this is a place for spoilers, right? When you guys do get to see the film, you'll see that there's a kind of transformation that happens, and also for me, it's happening in the mise en scène. So there's something about not just the performance and the setting that is transforming the space, but in Olingo, it's also literally transforming the space with things coming out of the suitcase, and it's becoming really a Black space. And then also the interaction changes. So where the child then has the courage to stand up to the father, it doesn't work. Olingo has to leave, and then has another walking scene. And so for me, the studio is it's not just in these two films, but in other films I see as well. So there's also a literal studio in Vanju Kinyanjui's short film, A Lover and a Killer of Color, and also the walking Black figure walking in the night and ending up in a studio space. And in that studio space, the protagonist is able to transform the kind of racist interactions that she's having with men. And she talks about how her paintbrush is like a weapon, you know. So again, it's this kind of space that keeps popping up in these like flaneur films where I find, and for me it's like the counterpoint to the walking somehow foreshadows that there's going to be this kind of speculative space where other things are possible.
Maybe you could also connect it to your own practice and the wonderful installation that you showed us in the end, you know, the thumbnail cinema, but also the brilliant idea of just filming the archive in which the film is hidden away, and that's a static shot. Also, you know, it's not an ambulatory camera. You just stay put there, and basically wait for the film to come out. So maybe you can say something about that particular space that you're creating there, which also seems to me to be a studio space.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, the static shot kind of mirrors these kind of like patient shots, and I guess this for me, these kind of long shots, and I mean you have a term in German for it, but these long shots are like so langatmen, you know, like they encourage a kind of different type of breathing and different type of possibility. So I know that I feel that in my body when I watch those long shots of Olingo lingo and Paul walking that I feel like a kind of different vibe. And so, yeah, for me in my practice, that was really important. It was a frustrating situation, actually, because, you know, I knew that the film was there, and then the information I got was kein Bestand, which is like, what does that mean? I mean, there's Bestand, but kein Bestand. So it was more of a question of the archive as a body without the orifices, you know, a body, because you say, like, I'm waiting for the film to come out, but this archive is absolutely constipated. It's not. There's no flow, so
it's an anal retentive institution.
Can be, but I think it's really, you know, it's important to talk about like the structural issues behind that, and also like you know, I think, you know, what Björn mentioned also earlier, it's like, you know, the kind of economy around cinemas and also around audiences and spectators, like, which I think you guys are also implicated in this, you know, in terms of like the value of you as a spectator, the value of me as a spectator. To go back to your sort of what you brought out quite it's quite a gift what you're saying about this static shot in my own practice. But yeah, I guess I'm sort of also playing with that, like the aspiration of a type of moving image, like how a moving image could also be a body, and to also have a kind of breath. Yeah.
Then staying put becomes a really powerful gesture, you know, rather than continuing to walk. Maybe another point about the film, about They Call It Love. I've just recently been rereading Georges Perec, Espèce d'Espace, as sort of, you know, writing about how can we think about space. And starts out with the bed, and then goes to the room and the house and the city and the countryside and the world. And as I was watching this film, I was thinking this is very much a film about spaces. It's very much a film that it's actually very analytic in those static shots and in those movements, and it really forces you to think about how these spaces are organized, and also how they're organized as spaces in which certain things are possible and others not. It's a bar that has a lot of African American black people in it, more than you would normally find in Munich, but it's clearly a meeting place of some sort, and as such it's very distinct from the rest of the spaces that we see in the film. So it's a film that has a very, very strong consciousness of space, and I would say is actually very much about space and about, I mean, this is also what you talk about in your analysis, but maybe you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, the difference between the bar space and the studio space. Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was watching it with you today, what the difference is. But I feel like there's other things are possible in the studio than in the bar. I feel like in the bar, I mean, let's face it, like I didn't talk a lot about the sex and the triangle in my talk because I wanted you guys to experience that. And it's not actually the part that I find that as exciting. But this man is really like a vending machine to these women. So, I mean, you know, it's kind of, in a way, this kind of, he becomes very two-dimensional in these outside spaces, but I find in the studio space he becomes whole. Paul becomes a full, you know, being, and so that for me that's different. He's really performing in the studio space, so it feels, or in the bar space, it feels like the studio space. But once you see the studio, you realize that is a performance, you know. And I think he's really performing this kind of role that he has to in order to have this belonging in Munich, you know, as opposed to respect. And I think for me, you know, we'd all much rather have respect than belonging. I mean, both would be great, but the respect is more in that studio space, and that's what's possible. But yeah, in terms of the spaces, and the reason why the walking is so important is that the walking is is an inscription. You know, it's a kind of, and this is maybe what I cut out earlier about like thinking about Michel de Certeau and practice of everyday life. This idea that walking is a language, and walking has it can inscribe something. So it has its like phrases and rhetorics, and you know, so it can work that way in terms of inscribing another story. So somehow for me, this walking is like also an inscription into that space, and also for the character later on, it indexes something else that's possible. Yeah.
I mean, maybe one last point before we go to questions from the audience. Maybe a detail, and maybe I'm overreading it, but what I find interesting in a bar is that there's never any applause. You know,
here.
So they play their songs, people dance, and but there's no reaction of anyone, and the walking scene that opens the film. I mean, one of the things that I instantly thought about is the famous opening scene of Saturday Night Fever, you know, which is a dance on the sidewalk, and it has a lot of that. You know, it's as you said, it's an inscription. It's a very specific way of walking. It's an appropriation of the space also through that inscription, and then it's in a real contrast to the kind of dancing that people perform to the music, which seems, you know, connected but also disconnected from the music. So.
Yeah, the rhythm of exactly, like what kind of rhythm. I think we were enjoying the dancing scenes really a lot. I'm the kind of person who always has to move also in music on film. Thank you for Saturday Night Live, or Saturday Night Fever. You can tell by the way I use my walk, I'm a woman's man, no time to talk. That's like, it could be the subtitle for this film. Yeah. But yeah, it's interesting what you say about the also the applause, and the lack of applause. That's interesting. I actually don't think I've ever noticed that before, that there's no applause there. I'm going to have to think about that, what that could mean. I enjoy the dancing scenes. It does seem, I mean, that's the one scene where I do notice a black woman, but what you notice is that the crowd is really kind of black men and white women, and there were a lot of bars like this at the time in Germany, also in Berlin, which were kind of catering to these encounters, you know. And so I think that perhaps that kind of stiffness is what we're getting also in the performance. It kind of works if you think about, like, again, this like vending machine type relationship that is like made possible in these spaces. Yeah.
No applause but sex. Yes. Do we have observations or questions from the audience? Yes, Danny, please. And Didi.
I was wondering if you could tell us more about the actor who played Paul, the protagonist. And I mean, there was something for me that reminded me a lot in his kind of affect and his presence on the screen, a lot of Gunter Kaufmann and Fassbinder's films. Just this kind of also this impassivity that he has a lot of the time in the film, I found very striking. But I just wondered, what's the actor's background? What else has he done? Like, what? Yeah.
So this is a question that I asked King when I had a chance to interview him also. And I was kind of, asking him about also how, why aren't there black women characters in the film? And he just expressed that at the time, it was very difficult to find black actors. So King was really kind of frustrated with the lack of German proficiency of the actor that he had. So I know that much. And I also know, and I mean, this is also to think about, something that I have to think about, of course, when I'm talking about these long walking scenes, are the practical elements of, making student films, in the 70s in Germany, also the resources that they had, so it was quite difficult to find a casting director or to find people who could act in the film. So it was really through word of mouth, as King told me. So again, this type of resource resources. So often, of course, practically these long shots are a good way to use cinema stock, but the practicality of it is one thing, like the actual intentions of the filmmaker, and then the text and how we can read it or something else. So, you know, I read in this kind of like staid performance from Paul also just this kind of negative affect, I guess, of like the situation that he's in. But you could also read it as like bad acting, I guess. But for me, there's more to it. You know. I didn't find it bad acting. Okay. I found it really fascinating acting. Yes. Like there's a real screen presence. Very striking. I agree. I mean, for me, the performance speaks so much beyond the dialogue. There's some facial expressions that he has that really touch me and really speak. And I think the way that the camera also frames him in those moments, you know, specifically also when he's singing. The one song, you know, the lyrics are so where he says that he's nothing, and then it's really kind of like that one kind of crash zoom. So I do feel that I'm glad that you also agree that the performance goes beyond the dialogue for this character. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had a feeling throughout the film that this guy is holding back so much. You know, that he's really having to restrain himself because he knows like what could happen to him if he speaks his mind in a lot of situations. So that, I mean, that is really the sense I got in that, like throughout the film. And then that contrast with his musical performances, which is where you can really see him like kind of be himself and express himself, or like just kind of like let loose in a way. So I like that contrast between that kind of extreme restraint and withholding and just kind of, you know, like just being permanent in this social situation where he has to do that. And then like when he's, you know, on the, like, you know, in the studio, he can just like, just be.
Yeah. That's the question. Why does he feel the need to restrain himself? So, because within the context of double consciousness and how we see ourselves through the eyes of others, and how we try to accommodate ourselves within the gaze of others. So, I'm curious about it because around about the time Michael Jackson died, I was writing as the contributing art critic for a major bourgeois newspaper in my country. And when Michael Jackson died, I was contracted to write a 7,000-word review of Michael Jackson's career. And now, of course, watching this film and within your reconstruction of the word Flânoirie, so I was wondering that what type of black people are permitted in white spaces. So because I said that when we say that Michael Jackson was the true crossover artist, why was it Michael Jackson? Why was it not James Brown, the godfather of soul? Because you say that it was a controversial because it caused a debate within an online group of Michael Jackson aficionados when I contested that James Brown was too black, too sexually aggressive, and it was necessary to look for a black artist who is a little bit sort of desexualized in such a way that he is not sexually threatening. And then when he is stripped of all these qualities, he is permitted in white space, because he does not possess a threat to white women. So as a black man, and the protagonist really does not seem black to me. So he looks so within the context of your idea, your reconstruction of the Flânoirie. So you know, what type of black male person is permitted to work in white spaces? Would you say that this film and your confirms or challenges borderless idea of the Flânoirie? So are black people permitted to also walk publicly in white spaces, or is the concept of the Flânoirie only permissible for a white male person and is not permissible to a black male person in white society?
Yes, I mean, what you're getting at, Didi, and thank you, is again this idea of the difference between belonging and respect. you know. So for me, you know, belonging is quite popular, but I find that it's kind of an uncomfortable word sometimes, because it's like, how do you belong? In what role would you belong in this space, right? And so yeah, this what you brought, the difference between James Brown and Michael Jackson, I would say that both are Flânoirie, because for me the Flânoirie is more about it's about seeing in how you're seen. So both are, as I say, like hyper invisible. So that means that they're invisible, but visible in a way, in a specific way. You know, invisible maybe to a type of understanding of a full-fledged human being with all the rights of society, invisible to that. But hyper visible in terms of surveillance and in terms of being, you know, I mean, like I can't walk around and not be seen. I think you know what I mean. So, so this is this kind of what I'm getting at in terms of the Flânoirie. And I think Michael Jackson, even in his kind of, you know, when he's made palatable, I think he's still hyper visible as a black man and under scrutiny. Yeah, and the moonwalk. I mean. That's Flânoirie at its best.
Yeah, I was just this made me think of two things, if I may briefly interject. First of all, something really important happens in pop music at the end of the 80s, namely the transition from pop charts based on playlists from radio stations to a computerized assessment of actual sales. When Tower Records starts transitioning to a computerized system of registering sales, that's what Nielsen starts to use to build their charts. Prior to that, Billboard charts were based on what radio DJs across the U.S. told Nielsen what they were playing. This is the moment when people find out that the majority of records sold and listened to are not records by white rock artists, but hip-hop. That's the moment when hip-hop becomes the absolute dominant genre of American pop culture, based on actual sales. So already there was this tension, or you know, there was an official white space layered onto something completely different. And to explain the kinds of sales that hip-hop was making, you can only explain that if you actually realize that white kids from the suburbs were listening to hip-hop and not Bon Jovi. And that's a really interesting turning point there, for which Michael Jackson certainly, you know, paved the way to a certain extent. And the other thing I was just thinking, suddenly a Flânoirie, in the sense of noir, came back to my mind. The autobiography of Louis Althusser is a very strange book. It's sort of, you know, he wrote it in the psychiatric hospital as a self-indictment because he wasn't put to trial for the murder of his wife, and he basically wanted to confess and wrote that book. And it's basically a book about what a horrible person his mother had been when he grew up in Algiers in the 1930s and 40s. But one of the observations there, and it's really interesting to read because he really has no sense of the oppressive logic of colonialism. For a Marxist philosopher, he's remarkably insensitive to what colonialism means. But there's this moment where he describes black men in bourgeois garb as flaneurs on you know, in the city of Algiers, in what is clearly white space, and they're exiled kings and royalty from West Africa, who were basically sent to Algiers into exile to decapitate the power structures that could potentially be the basis for an insurrection against colonialism. So they were allowed into white space in recognition of their status, in the kind of dress that you would see in, you know, a bourgeois white person in the city of Algiers, but they were in exile. And it's a really weird double coding, which, by the way, Althusser does not understand at all, and doesn't think about twice. But it's a detail that struck him and that stuck with him, and that he registers. But it's a really interesting sort of, you know, perverse granting of privilege, which at the same time is a complete destruction of these people's origin and power structure.
Yeah, it's also, you know, belonging under certain conditions. When you're speaking, it made me think about the French soldiers in the south of Germany, also in Rhineland. You know, they're also Flânoirie, you know, but also, again, what Didi was saying, you know, this kind of fear of black male relationships with white women was then penalized, you know, with forced sterilization. So yeah, this idea of like this kind of danger is quite prevalent in yeah, especially when you're walking freely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Other comments, questions, observations? Yeah, please.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk in the beginning, and I think it also really shaped my view of the movie. And what I had to think about especially was about, because some years ago I was with some friends from university trying to find out if there is like a flâneuse, like a female version of the flâneur, yeah. Because it's actually kind of a missing figure, so it doesn't really exist, but there are, of course, ways of thinking about that. She can exist in a way, and what's her role, and what's her moving in the city means as also a form of reacting and resisting to patriarchal structures around. And then in the movie I was also, it was very obvious that the black woman was missing. And so now I had to think about this this role of the everything that's not the flâneur in the sense, and how like how would you say is the flâneur also gendered, and how did you react also to seeing I don't know how it is in other black German movies, but where the black woman in this role is maybe.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I decided to kind of make this word not gendered by putting the E on it. I don't know how that will pan out, but I wanted to do it that way. But you're right. But then the context is important then. But the film that I just mentioned earlier, Vanjiro Kinyanjui's film, A Lover and a Killer of Color, yeah, there's something interesting also happening there. There the protagonist is walking at night as opposed to during the day, and often sort of seen from the back. But also walking at night for a woman is really something special. And talking about the flâneuse, so, and Friedberg speaks about that, and the idea of like how the flâneuse, you know, is like would be considered a night walker. You know, if a flâneur is walking at night, it's like, oh, I'm looking at the Palisades, I'm checking out things, I am a chronicler of the city. But if a woman walks at night, then suddenly, you know, she's a woman of the night. So this idea of, you know, window shopping and walking by shopping windows, and the light from the shopping windows can kind of also create a cinematic effect as you walk and look into different windows. So in a way, in Vanjiro Kinyanjui's film, this strong, confident black woman walking alone at night is quite a stark kind of image. And then she enters the studio where she then, you know, tells this, she's reciting a poem, which is really kind of an indictment of a former lover. So there, again, it's like a literal studio. And so again, this place is kind of, for me, indexed by this kind of walking. It's like the exhale to the inhale. Yeah.
Yeah, I have another question. Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. We'll
like there.
Hit it.
Thanks, Karina, for your wonderful talk. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about your understanding of Christina Sharp's black annotation and black redaction in relation to the film, and also in relation to the Flânoirie. So is the walking and inscribing yourself in the space a form of annotation? Is maybe the restraint that Danny was speaking about a form of redaction? I also thought about his room in the film and the Kennedy picture, and then there's like two or three other pictures around it. That also made me think of annotation. So I was just wondering, is that like, how do you bring that to bear on this example, maybe the other one as well?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, I feel that, yeah, especially in a shorter film, but in this film, like the mise en scène is like an act of annotation, because as soon as you enter that room and you pick it up, that it's like shorthand for who this person is. And in terms of reduction, in the Flânoirie, I mean, yeah, I guess in that sense, that's a really interesting question, because I think there I'm thinking also about other affects and other sort of formal aspects of the film in terms of like editing. But those long shots where Paul is walking, there is a kind of reduction in terms of not being able to see any other points of view. It is just one shot, so you don't see his perspective, you don't get the reverse shot, so it's really a kind of reduced, I would say, way of showing this scene. So for me, that would be an aspect of reduction. Yeah.
Up here.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction and for showing this really interesting film. I also noticed the absence of applause, and I also noticed the absence of explicit racism. And I had a thought about this, because there is this huge difference between US-American blackness in Germany compared to other forms of blackness. So I'd be interested, what are your thoughts about this, also in terms of who owns the space? Because the US-American people who were in Germany were here as Besatzer, in a way. So they didn't come from a poor country or something. And I think it makes a big difference in terms of the inscription in the street or in the space where these people come from and what's their position in the society. So maybe you have thoughts about this.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's really important when thinking about intersectionally about these films. So both Paul, so here in They Call It Love, and also just briefly the student also who's in Olingo is a medical student coming on exchange with a scholarship, you know, so also kind of a person of privilege, a black male figure of privilege in Europe. And so and also Paul, I mean, it seems like everything in this film costs 8 mark, right? He's always like 8 mark, the magazines were 8 mark, was it 80 mark? 80 mark. 20 per magazine, and then in the tax
per record.
But with the magazines, and then were also they were 8 mark, and then and then the cab also. I mean, he just had a lot of money, and he didn't seem to have a problem giving it away. Yeah. So this is also an aspect of privilege. So you're right in that sense that it's not a kind of discrimination that's connected to class, So he's in an absolute privileged class, but it's more for me the way that he is being used, and the fact that you get a sense, and from the performance that the performance within the performance that Paul has to play these roles in a way like for me I can't make sense of, and that's why I'm a projectionist. That's why I just have to I don't have to interpret, but I cannot make sense of this relationship with the wife. You know, like what it seems like he clearly actually likes the record shop girl, but then there's this relationship with the wife. And so, you know, watching it today, I was thinking, okay, is there some sort of, like, in order to keep his relationship with the husband, the record store owner, where he does kind of get some free records and things, you know, is that part of a kind of symbiotic relationship? Keep the wife happy, you know? Sometimes even the reaction of the husband to finding out about Anne, the record shop girl, kind of, you know, being in the space, the way that he looks, you even think that like he's part of this, it's a love square or something. Like he looks really personally offended, you know, like not my power, like, you know, as if they maybe have a relationship there. So this idea that Paul is just up for grabs for anybody, and then in the lyrics of the songs you kind of feel the pain of that. So that's, I think, how the racism manifests itself, and specifically here.
Yeah, but it's also possible that the reason you don't notice overt racism was probably because it was pre-9/11 the film, so there has not been the obvious policing of non-white bodies in European, in white spaces, because this was before 9/11, I think. So probably that's way before. Why. Yes. Well, so probably that was because there was not, and that was way after Jim Crow and the rest. So maybe between that period, so maybe that's why there was no obvious racism in that time. So I mean, you could also, in the current period, maybe you reference like your initial presentation, Eric Garner, George Floyd, and all of that triggered all those stuff. So maybe the film could be situated at a particular point in time. So there was no overt racism in the. It seems similarly that there was no racism in the film. So I do think that there was racism in the film. That was why there was no obviously black person in the film. So.
Yes?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. I'll keep it short. But what I found really interesting about the film and Flânoirie and this idea of like visibility and visibility, for me, it hit more in the direction of immigrant, because I'm from Brazil, and I've lived here for 8 years. And I think that there's a very interesting aspect of being other and being in permanent negotiation of self-expression and restraint, so annotation and redaction, that I thought was very visible in the film. And with the acting as well, in the beginning, I was kind of thrown off, but there is this, like, speaking in a different language and interacting in a different culture, there is a delay, there is kind of like a difficulty of engaging, which I think the acting generally makes also very visible, which I thought was really good.
This is really helpful what you just said, and thank you so much for your comment, because, you know, I'm thinking about a kind of grammar in terms of walking as a language. It has a grammar, and as you were speaking, I was thinking, yeah, this kind of inability for Paul to really get through the grammar in his speaking is made up for the grammar of his walking. I mean, he really has swag. So it's really quite helpful what you just brought. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I could add a personal anecdote. Do you want to hear it? One night, a few years ago, I was late for this event, and I had to run a few red lights in the Bahnhofsviertel to make it on time. But there were too many red lights that I ran because I was stopped by the police. They pulled up behind me and asked for my papers. So I pulled out my Swiss ID, and a policeman looked at it and said, "Oh, you're Swiss, so you know nothing's going to happen to you here." You understand? Wrong name, wrong ID, problem. He was clearly telling me there's a grammar of behavior and there are consequences for misbehavior, but being a Swiss person, I enjoyed a privilege of being exempt from those rules, you know, and I was read as someone who was offending and transgressing. But when I showed my ID, which normally would be the moment when I would, you know, get a fine at least, or, you know, some legal procedure would start, that was the end of it. That was the end of it. And, you know, those are multiple offenses punishable by fines. Not even that. It was just, okay, you go. And that was the inverse of exactly the kind of implicit grammar of space that pretty much everyone is subjected to, and everyone who is marked as somehow, you know, someone whose ID you need to check will remain subjected to when infringing upon the rules. I think that's the definition of white privilege, right?
You got it.
Yes, please, Marie. No.
No, we need the mic.
We're recording the debate, and we need to have your question on tape.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk as well. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask what you think about the position of the camera, especially in the studio scene, because I found it really specific, because you're always kind of behind, and like in both of the kind of shots, and I wonder what kind of spectatorship that imagines as well. Like you're never fully permitted maybe to be part of the scene. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. So I think that studio scene, as you recall, at first you're in the sound booth. So already you're kind of, you know, in a way the studio is protected with this extra fragile layer of glass, so protected from projection even, perhaps, you know, in terms of like a reflection as well. And this is also, I mean, in a short way, in the first scene in the record shop that he goes in, and then it's behind the glass. So, and I also noticed that it's even a little bit lower, the camera, like I'm looking up, so they're even a bit larger than life, which is a different camera angle. It's not straight on in terms of these shots. So there is something happening with the camera as well that is giving a kind of privilege, I would say, to these characters in those scenes. Yeah.
Maybe a quick follow-up on this. I was actually already with the credits coming on in the title sequence. I was checking for names that did not sound Bavarian, German, or Swiss, and I didn't find a single one. So what we need to understand is that the King Ampaw was working on a set where he was probably the only person of color. Did he ever talk about this, and how did?
He didn't talk to me about this, but again, Evangelio Kinyanjui spoke to me about this. Like, you know, the work of having to get the team together in the Filmhochschule. So she was studying in Berlin, and even though she had tons of experience, was also like producing television while she was studying. She said that the other students didn't believe that she, you know, had the talent to do things, and you needed to, you know, do camera on somebody else's and maybe edit or assistant direct. So she had a hard time putting her team together, you know, and so she had to also go out and recruit and talk to friends of friends and things like this. So again, it's these kinds of material resources, questions about the making of these films. And, you know, I'm saying, you know, these films are they're made in a specific type of context. So as much as I mean, in another project, I think about a different affect, which is connected more to the cinematography. So I'm interested in just briefly like how light can become dark in a cinema. So when there's like overexposure or supersaturation, and what does that mean in a black film when darkness is treated when light is treated the same way as darkness, so something super saturated, so you also cannot see, things are also obscured. And looking at like autodidact films made by refugee claimants at Bauhaus Nauninstrasse, and like some of it is just an error. It's like, okay, they didn't white balance, right? What happens when you don't white balance a black film? And so it might be an accident, but how can we read that? What can that also index in terms of, you know, a different type of way of seeing? Yeah.
I mean, as Abschlussfilme go, this is a pretty amazing achievement.
Yeah, King said so himself. He says that actually he was the best graduate because Wim Wenders and Werner Herzog only made short films.
Right.
And he was the only one who made a feature film. So he would agree with you.
It's totally amazing. I mean, the Roland Emmerich made a feature film, but he came from money and basically put up like $1.5 million Deutschmarks to produce his own science fiction film, which was his calling card in Hollywood, and it worked out for him. But as Abschlussfilme at the HFF München go, this is an amazing achievement, really. And just, you know, like the technical and organizational aspect of it, apart from everything that we just talked about, is really quite impressive. Yeah.
I think he made one of the things that is being searched for in Africa, Love Brewed. I think he made Love Brewed in the African pot. One of the feature films he made in Ghana. I think some years ago, Nollywood decided to give him an award. So as one of the pioneers of Africa, especially Anglophone African cinema. So and I'm really, really impressed at the time he made this film and the quality of I'm really surprised that, oh yeah, this is actually, he did some good work. And thank you so much for introducing me to this because I did not know it. So I only know what his other stuff from Africa. So, and I think he's really, but it goes also to what we are saying about archives and accessibility to archives. So there are these films, but you know these films exist, but then normally you don't normally have access to these films. So it's usually something I don't like so much. And I was talking about this in Mainz 2 days ago, that I always have to come to Europe to see African films.
Absolutely, that needs to change. But for the time being, we're here and projecting them. So
yeah, and thank you so much for that opportunity. It's been great to see it with all of you and on the large screen again. So it's been really, really a great experience.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for bringing the film to us and making it see the way we just saw it, and we're able to talk about it with you. Thank you so much.
Welcome, thank you.
All right. We will continue the series in 1 week. Janaina Oliveira will join us from Rio de Janeiro, and she put together a program of short films, Afro-Brazilian short films. Lots of discoveries to be made. Please join us again. See you next week. All right.